So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This translation truly comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Israel, the prophets of old, from the time of the prophets of Yahweh, indicating many events of the future, so then we could understand the end of time. Please bear in mind, when you begin to understand the holy prophecies, you're not depending upon the person teaching you or then showing you or then explain or give you the information. You don't base your actions and then having as a reference a person is speaking of them. You should have as a reference as the Messiah is speaking. And your sense of value does not come from a person, rather from the Messiah. It's very important speaking of these topics, because what many people have learned so far is what they can do. Try to understand, they try to form or mold their own future. They learn so much and they study, and they form a fictitious future. And then when you're speaking of fictitious future, you have to have a person that has to be perfect to be a reference guide. Because whatsoever you find when a person is not perfect for their standards, then they condemn. And they condemn so quickly because they are already condemned. So being aware of what the Messiah said, because the future is already set, and it's not as complicated as many people were thinking. There are a couple of basic understandings of the Revelation. Very simple, extremely simple. You have then the completion of the second portion of the Torah, Revelation, the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd verse through the 44th verse. You have the entire Revelation, and then you have a saga of Gentiles and then set apart. That's what goes on with it. But then we must understand this factor. The vengeance does not start until the Gentiles are eliminated. Meaning those who were testifying of the Messiah then are dead. And then only remains the holy cities, the holy city, and then the rest of them are going to join up with Satan. There is no mid person anymore, because it's time of vengeance, vindication. So the Gentiles are going to be then eliminated prior of the starting of the vengeance. So then when you read the first chapters of Revelation, you are then reading what Yohanan saw. Those main 7 churches, Smyrna, Ephesus, and Philadelphia, and so on and so forth, those were the anchoring places from where then the actual vengeance would come from. Those must remain. However, then the Gentiles are not part of the vengeance. The Gentiles and the believer and the Messiah, those then, the believers in the Messiah, they're going to die prior of the starting of the vengeance. When the vengeance starts, then truly is then the people outside, the evil people, and the holy cities and the holy city. Then the vengeance starts. Because you have to evaluate the situation as per the scripture. Would not be fair for having outside evil people mixed with the halfway believers. The halfway believers would be then unjustly placed under judgment for no reason, because they have a part of themselves in the Messiah. So then they have to earn their place of rest and being eliminated until then the vengeance starts. Yahweh is very just. He is absolutely pure and He is absolutely perfect. So then the Gentiles and the Messiah, they are going to be eliminated. That's why when you read in the 6th chapter, then you read the altars, speaking of the many cities, and then you find the people outside doing testimony or making testimony or sharing the Messiah with other people. And those are going to be slaughtered until the number of them are completed. Then the actual vengeance starts. Then there is no more going outside of the holy camps. There is no reason for it. Then starts the vengeance. So there are many events coming at the same time. Then you have a section of it explaining this area, and shortly after then comes the atomic blast. Then when the bomb hits the ground and makes the hole in the ground, that is the pit. Try to understand, there is only a pit. Everywhere you read in Revelation, there is only a pit, only a reference point. There are no multiples. The reason why many people interpret as being multiples is because they don't understand the layering factor. There are many Megillas playing at the same time while you read Revelation. It's always the same topic. When it speaks of the pit, then it's only a pit. It's when then the bomb hits the ground. Then you have to understand what takes place in a level of the earth and level of heaven. So then when we read Revelation in terms of the 20th chapter, then we find the 1,000 years then granted to His people, then the other 1,000 years granted to Satan. But then you have to understand the context. Because as we understand, these scriptures, they must be spaced. And there is another factor we must be very aware of. When the Greco and the Romans, they began to scoundrelize the scripture, they changed the events so then they would manipulate. Because this was then used as a political, manipulative document. You have to understand the concept of the time. They had many Megillas over there and they were translating. So they were thinking, how could they change the times and seasons and then manipulate the people so then they would be obedient to their kingdoms, their governments? This was the factor. So when you read then in flat surfaces, it's absolutely confusing. When you read in layers, then it's much easier. So then comes the first 1,000. And then the 20th chapter. Saw then the angel that descended from heaven, having then the key of the pit. It is a symbolic spiritual understanding. He is speaking of a time when then the holy cities were persecuted, and then in 1009 the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Muslims. Also the tomb. There were no more cities to be destroyed. If Satan the destroyer, the fast after the destroyer, would be left without going to prison, he would destroy the world. There was nothing else to be destroyed. So then, in the spirit, you find then this pit. Okay, it would be in a spirit a set time where then you have an event locked in place then to be unlocked later. In the spirit, you have to understand the layers to make sure then you have the proper understanding. When Yahweh was speaking with Shimon in the 7th chapter of Ecclesiastes, you find areas from the 7th and through the 9th. Then the Messiah was also involved in other areas related with the same topic, speaking of those bound until the time of the end. Try to understand, there are then areas where then these spirits are bound until the day of judgment. The understanding is they are not bound, they are going to and fro on the earth. But then in terms of the final decision making, they are bound in the future. So then when you read Revelation and then you state having the key of the pit, meant these destroyer facets going to be bound in this particular point in time until the bomb hits the ground. So then you begin to understand what it meant. His facet of the deceiver had taken over. 1009. Okay? It was a time given to Satan to verify if he could lie to the world and make sure the world would be saved. He was given a chance also. So he mixed then Gentile ruling for 1,000 years plus what they thought, what he made it up as being heaven. Thus you have both layers then glued together, mixed up together for 1,000 years. From 1009 to 2009, or 5009 to 6009. That's the layer where you read the 20th chapter. But you don't go by the 20. You go by the layer. Layer, time, and season. Layer, time, and season. Layer, time, and season. The numbers are not important. The numbers are not important because then when the translators they start translating the scripture, they had many Megillas. And they did not know what to do with them. They did not make any sense out of those. So they tried to read part of it because they are placing these in a codex. It has to be then in sequence. But thinking in sequence as flat surfaces in codexes, those are Gentile, pagan understanding. Those never match it with the Spirit. From Hebraic thinking, Hebraic understanding, Hebraic information from heaven. So this can clarify some of the problems why people don't understand Revelation. So then when you begin to read, then you understand. Then the great Satan who then deceived the nations. And then he said, deceiver, Satan, seducer, and so on and so forth. Those are facets. Okay? When the angel was bounding him, he was then the very spiritual being with many facets. He was then deceiver, destroyer, seducer, and so on and so forth, liar, you name it. However, when his part of himself went down into this spiritual prison, was only his facet of destroyer. However, the rest of it became active. And known is then the deceit, time of deceit. So then later, after the 1,000 years, when the bomb explodes and forms the pit in the ground, then his facet of destroyer comes out of it. Then he knows he have then a short time. Then he's going to deceive. You understand? There is a chameleon understanding over there that he then combines his deceit with destroying. What is the deceit? Was the time during the 1,000 years. Precisely what the people do not want to come out of. Transitional time. The Messiah, when he came to the earth, he was transitioning the people from the first service and the second service. Let me ask you this. Did the people of his time like his teachings of the transitional time? No. In fact, they hated him. Because they were so used to their own junky religions, they refused the Messiah. In our time is the same situation. We are transitioning ourselves from the lies of the past 1,000 years back into the truth. Do we like it? No, we want to be with the old junkies. Oh, the Messiah, he knew it. He experienced the same situation. Far worse, because he was dealing with a mixture of the laws of Moses that came from heaven, than with a people that did not want to change. It's the same situation these days. 1,000 years has gone by. Junkies, absolutely junkies. People don't understand. What do you understand of your own scripture? Oh, I don't understand Revelation. Oh, isn't that your God then? God of a confusion? You have to be honest with yourselves. So you read your scripture, you're not sure of it. Why don't you understand then Revelation? So then your God is confused. At least be honest with yourself. Before you point out other people, finding junk in other lives, and then scrutinizing other people's lives, make sure you understand your God first. I think it's very fair. So then Yohanan is explaining what he saw in terms of the facet of the destroyer went to prison in 1009 or 5009. Then he would released much later. Then came the end of the 1,000 years, but then we'd have to understand the time of the gap spoken of by the Messiah. So you entered another layer. That's why understanding times and seasons is so critical, because then you begin to form your understanding, your foundation based upon the prophets, times, and the seasons. So when you begin to understand the proper time, 5009 rather than 1009, then you begin to understand the proper time. When you begin to understand Revelation is the autumn feast, then you are understanding in seasons. So it's much easier to understand in times and seasons. But then many people don't understand even their own God. They read their own scripture, they don't understand it, so their God is a God of a confusion. But then, boy, they are quickly to judge other people. If they watch other people doing what they shouldn't be doing, boy, they are so quick to condemn it. And they condemn based upon what they don't understand. So then, he seduced then the whole world and bound him for 1,000 years. However, try to understand the context. What is the context? The facet of a destroyer went to prison. What was then the other facet that would dominate the world? Deceit. Seducing, lying, cheating, murdering. Those remained. So then when you read, and he cast him into the pit, and closed and sealed upon him, that he might not destroy. The word is not deceit, the word is destroyed. Deceit remains. There we go again. The Greco and the Romans did not understand what it was. They thought they were the people doing and translating properly, so they thought what the Hebrews were doing were deceit. They thought what the Hebrews were doing was Satan. They thought what the Hebrews were doing then was the evil. But it was not. It was the contrary. So when you read, and he, the angel, cast him, Satan, into the pit, and closed and sealed upon him, so that he might not destroy. It's not deceit, it's destroy. The nations no more until these 1,000 years would be completed. That makes sense. Because he was after the holy cities. He destroyed them until he did not have any more holy cities. But then he had only the city. And then he destroyed also the city. Had nothing else to do. So the angel came down, and his facet of destroyer went to prison. So then his facet of deceit had taken over. So when you read deceit, it's not deceive. It is destroyer. And then later, when the bomb hits the ground and forms the pit, then the face of the destroyer comes out of prison. Then he combines with a dormant deceit. Why is it dormant deceit? Because we are transitioning ourselves back to the truth. And when the people begins to learn the truth, then the lies, they begin to be dormant. You know what dormant means? It's placed aside for a moment. You know, volcanoes, when they are dormant, they are there active, but they are not erupting. Deceit. We are transitioning ourselves from the 1,000 years of deceit back into the truth. The lies of the 1,000 years, then they are going to be dormant. Not eliminated, but dormant. Until the bomb hits the ground. Then the destroyer comes out of the pit, and then he's going to deceive. Those areas of deceit that were dormant, he's going to entice them. So then you begin to understand what it means. Understanding in layers. Have the first 1,000 and the other 1,000. So then what you read in the 20th chapter truly is part of the 8th chapter. Where do you find when the bomb hits the ground? 8th chapter. What does it say? Distinct Megillas. Yohanan was reading part of it in the Megillah, and then the other part was in the other Megillah. Properly layered, so a person would understand the layers of understanding. The Greco-Romans did not have a clue of it. And they twisted so badly that when they were translating this factor, they thought that the Hebrews were the evil people. They were the Satan. They were the people then from the 1,000 years, and they made a salad out of it. In quote. But then when you understand the concept, then you understand what the Messiah spoke was true. The Greco and the Romans, they twisted badly and they made a heck out of it. Twisted, it's junk. So this is the proper translation. You read then the 3rd verse, 20th chapter is not deceive, is destroyer, the facet of destroyer. Then the other 1,000 years would be then the time of deceit. His facet of deceiver was then at work. He deceived the world in terms of what he thought was then heaven, holy, or then divine. Because he switched around thinking the Hebrews then are the evil people. The Hebrews, they don't understand God. The Hebrews, they don't understand heaven. The Hebrews don't understand what the Messiah said. And then he came up with their own concocted theories. The problem is the word tabernacle is a Hebrew word. It requires a physical place, a physical tabernacle for a deity to come and to live with them. You have to have the tabernacle because the Messiah told his people, whatsoever Moses told you to do and observe, these do and observe. He meant they would have to use then the Holy Tabernacle in the future. And how do you have a Messiah outside of the Holy Tabernacle? It was Satan himself posing as. Judging the Hebrews. No, the Hebrews are the evil people. The Hebrews are the people that came out with a law. Those are absolute laws that can't be then obeyed. They are the people causing these, that, and the other. And they formed their own religion. Then you have then the true Hebrew people rejecting the Messiah as a group, and then the other group thinking that the Hebrews are the evil people. And then the Messiah in the center of it. No, neither of them. Whatsoever Moses told you to do and observe, these do and observe. So there is the group of people with the Messiah. He goes around both of these groups. And he said to his people, go around the world, form holy cities. That's what they did. So then he continues. Then he saw thrones and persons sat on them in the judgment. Then he has a vision of heaven. What is going up there in the heavens? And then he saw what was going on. And then it was described. And then it comes to the other 1,000 years, then when the Messiah was then in charge. And then you have to understand what he meant. And then after the 1,000 years where his people then would be in charge. So what it means is he's explaining after his people would be in charge, because the previous understanding was a vision from heaven. So you have to link then the 1,000 years of his people giving directives with heaven's directives. After the 1,000 years of Satan came in, he saw then the judgment and he saw visions from heaven. So the natural understanding in the Hebraic, you link then heavens with heaven. After his people then was then in charge for 1,000 years, much later, means the first 1,000, and then comes the other 1,000 when Satan was then, and then comes after, because it's speaking of the pit. And then you have to link up the 20th with the 8th chapter. That's when the actual pit, then the bomb explodes. So then you don't go by numbers anymore. You have to understand then the layers of each of them so you can relate properly. Thus you understand there were many Megillas, many writings, many records, and they did not know how to put together. Okay, start making more sense, doesn't it? Please stay tuned.